Good afternoon, dear participants at this conference. I would like to tell you that despite the fact that the initiative did not come from my own political group, this is my favorite conference in the last year of the mandate. And I would like to welcome all panelists and all participants, and I see that more and more words begin with the word post. And we have post-industrial, post-communist, post-modern, not yet post-Trump time, and post-growth time. And I would like to approach this issue from another point of view. I was a cancer patient more than 15 years ago, and I'm pleased that I'm a cancer survivor. And since I was diagnosed with that quite unpleasant diagnosis, I've been more attentive to the distinction between the following words: expansion, development, progress, growth. What was happening with my cells was definitely a development. We can name everything development, whatever is changing. And more crazy revolutionary cells were there. In a way, there was a progress, because their number was progressively increasing. And from a certain point of view, we could speak about growth. The cells were unstoppably growing. In fact, it was just an expansion which could lead to death, as we know many cases as far as cancer is concerned. And I think that our future depends very much on our ability to distinguish between development, expansion, progress, and growth. I remember the report of the Club of Rome about the limits of growth, I would say several decades ago. I was a young researcher at the Urban Planning Institute in Ljubljana in Slovenia. And I welcomed that report. And later, by the way, as somebody born on a small farm who became even a beekeeper, I welcomed the concept of the organic growth. And I welcomed also what happened in Bhutan, where the government decided to measure gross domestic index of happiness, as you may know. And I will not enter into theories. I intend to mention only one feature of the organic growth. It does not harm anybody or anything. I also don't like to be romantic or naive. I know that organic growth is assured by the algorithms of the nature. This has not been the fact with economic and other growth, which depends on human concepts. Natures know what is organic. Humans have to agree on that. Until we will continue with the concept of competitiveness aimed at dominating or excluding the other players, we will not reach an organic algorithm. We will play more the game who is who than what is what. And I think that we are interested in growth of power and not in the power of growth. We like more expansion, and we sell it as development and progress. So I'm pleased that we will try to discuss some aspects of post-growth or degrowth today with these outstanding panelists on my right and my left side. And I would like to thank you for your initial attention. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Bjorn Döhring, who works at the European Commission, Director General of Economic and Financial Affairs. He is the head of the Economic Situation Forecast Business and Consumer Surveys Unit. I will not say more, but I consider you as a future-telling person, so please tell us, what do you see in front of us? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. It's really an honor to be at this conference that is being organized by different political families. I think in the nomenclature of Philip Lambert's, I would rather fall into the field of an orthodox economist, Also, as a forecaster, I'm usually focused more on the near term. So thank you for challenging me to look today a bit beyond that. I need to make the usual disclaimer. What I'm going to tell you are my views and not necessarily those of the European Commission. With that, next slide, please. Let's move into the outline. First, so we are talking about models here today. I understand model as simply a simplified representation of a complex reality. Now, the introduction to this session talks about the crushing power of economic models. That sounds quite brute and a bit dangerous. So I will first ask, what is wrong with economic models? There are serious problems and limitations to the models we have. Nonetheless, we use them, and I will, in my second part, walk you through the zoo of models that we have in DG ECFIN. And then third, look a bit at areas of expansion and improvement, though there I'm already moving out of my depth and into the area of the other speakers on the panel. My objective today is to convince you that economic models are useful tools to help economists think about complex issues and not some dark instruments of domination. Next slide, please. So what is wrong with economic models? The first thing that comes to mind, could you move the slide, please? The first thing that comes to mind is the question Queen Elizabeth asked to economists at the LSE in the autumn of 2008, namely, why did none of you see this coming? Indeed, the forecasting models at the time, and to some extent still today, had a blind spot when it came to the financial sector, which did not help. But there's a more general point about models. They're estimated on data that are observed in the past. And when statistical relations break down in a crisis, there's not much that the model can be used for in these circumstances. A second point that is often raised for economic models is that they have an anthropological poverty. They focus on an agent who is representative, who is immortal, has fully rational expectations, and is a selfish maximizer of consumption. This Homo economicus, you can say, has quite a reputation. There are much richer concepts of human nature in other sciences, philosophy, theology. I think Nicole will present us some interesting concepts later on. But fundamentally, the criticism of Homo economicus misses the issue, because any model is a simplification. Yes, Homo economicus is reductionist, but he helps understanding us real-world features. He helps understanding us what factors are driving specific outcomes, and he helps make us models that can be solved mathematically. Crucially, Homo economicus is not normative. This is not an ideal that you should try to follow. It's just a tool. The third criticism is that economic models are too narrowly concerned with economic growth. We heard this morning the expressions fetish and religious obstination with growth. Well, 2 points on that. The first is, obviously, GDP is only part of a bigger picture. The second, economic growth is required nonetheless, in the short run and also in the long run. Gross domestic product is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. We have heard that this morning as well. Next slide, please. So let's try to put that a bit into context. The end is well-being or prosperity, as Tim Jackson has called it, or flourishing, as Aristotle has called it. Now, if you look at the upper part, economic activity contributes to underpinning material well-being, but well-being has many other dimensions of which GDP tells you nothing. Even if you look into economic activity, GDP gives you an incomplete picture. If I eat an apple, my well-being is not affected whether the apple is from a tree in my garden or whether it is from the grocer down the street. But in GDP, only the latter will be counted because it is market-based and my home production is not. If you look at the bottom right, well-being and economic activity interact with sustainability, ecological, social, and political sustainability. And I've added inequality as a disturbance to all three dimensions because we know that inequality disturbs well-being. We all tend to compare our well-being, material well-being, to those of the neighbors. We know that inequality affects political and social sustainability. We talked about that this morning. And inequality even affects GDP growth. So focusing too narrowly on GDP is indeed conceptually questionable. Next slide, please. Let's have a look at the role of GDP in economic policy then, and let me start with a clarification. Economics is not the art of maximizing GDP. Economics is the science of managing scarce resources efficiently. Managing scarce resources efficiently. That means that beyond the well-being, there's already a sustainability dimension in our profession. And indeed, environmental economics has come up with a concept like the polluter pays principle, which is central to environmental policy today. Economics traditionally has shied away from questions of distribution and has left considerations of fairness to the political domain. It also does not tell you how to flourish. It has no ethical prescriptions. That also is true the other way around. Economics does not advocate consumerism or insatiability. John Maynard Keynes wrote an interesting essay in the 1930s where he explained that once most people have moved beyond meeting their most basic needs, they will start reducing their weekly labor and enjoy much more leisure. So this rat race that we also heard about this morning is not necessarily built into economics. Well, now that I've said a lot of things limiting the role of GDP, let's focus on where it actually matters. GDP growth is instrumental to reducing unemployment. We are just coming out of a deep and protracted crisis, and unemployment in many countries is still high. Growth will help us reduce unemployment. It will also help us lifting living standards and reducing poverty, which is a more medium to long-term goal. But how can we have long-term growth if resources are finite? Well, in the long run, GDP per capita growth mostly comes from technological progress and from productivity gains. And we were discussing this morning whether those are slowing down and what that would mean for growth and for the necessity or possibility of decoupling. Because if you have productivity growth, your GDP can increase at constant inputs of resources. So in principle, decoupling should be possible. But there are a lot of thorny issues around that I don't have the time and the competence to venture into right now. Let me rather focus on the models that we use and turn back to the topics of this session. Next slide, please. So here's a short overview of what we use in DG ECFIN. For the forecast that my team is responsible for, we use various models with different time horizons and different architecture. If you want to know what is GDP growth going to be like in the third quarter of 2018, we look at the correlation of GDP with some indicators like business and consumer surveys, like industrial production. So these models are based on statistical correlations. They contain no theory. Looking a bit further ahead, we use a Bayesian vector autoregressive model that was initially developed by researchers at the ECB. It is also based on statistical observations and does not contain any theory, but it has a richer interaction of the variables within and also allows us to simulate, for instance, giving an impulse to investment growth and see how that would affect the other variables in the system. Then the more sophisticated tool is our global multi-country model that is an estimated dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model that is sort of the workhorse of macroeconomic modeling. It was built for us by the Joint Research Center of the Commission. It is based on neo-Keynesian theory and has micro foundations. This is where Homo economicus really comes in. It allows us to make conditional forecasts. We make a couple of assumptions, say about the exchange rate, interest rates, and growth outside the EU, and then look what the model tells us growth in the EU is likely to be like. It also allows scenario analysis, and since it is much richer in variables, you get more interactions between the various ingredients. Other models used in DG ECFIN comprise the Quest model that is also a DSGE model, but it has many additional features, and these can be used in a modular way, allowing for more refined scenario analysis. And then finally, we have a couple of sector models. Let me mention just one that compares house prices that are observed with fundamentals that have been identified as drivers of house prices, and that allows you to see if there are any emerging imbalances. Now, given that the crisis in 2008 was triggered by a housing boom and bust, the interest in this kind of model is quite obvious. I have two caveats about the use of models. The first is sophisticated models are not necessarily the better ones. The forecasting accuracy of DSGE models is not much better than the forecasting accuracy of the kind of structural models that we had since the 1970s. There's also an article by Paul Krugman from earlier this year where he argues that, lucky enough, a lot of the policy prescriptions during the crisis were based on these old-fashioned models, and according to him, outcomes were better for that reasons. My second caveat is that economic judgment is always required. You need to be aware what your model can do and what its limitations are. Our forecast, for instance, is based on the judgment of country desk officers. They use models, but in the end, they are responsible for the forecast they make, and they are being held responsible for the forecast errors that they make. The next slide, please. Let me talk quickly about recent trends in macro modeling. The crisis has definitely led to a rethinking of macroeconomic modeling. The incorporation of the financial sector into DSGE models is one thing. There's also work to relax the assumption of a homogeneous rational agent. There's rich material for that coming, for instance, from behavioral economics. Strand started by Kahneman and Tversky already in the late 1960s, and Kahneman has won the Nobel Prize for that in 2002. So, yes, we are introducing bounded rationality and different types of agents into our models, and we are also learning from other disciplines. Arthur will talk about agent-based modeling in a few minutes. And another area where we have learned from other disciplines is modeling financial crisis with epidemiological models. So some aspects of crisis spread like a virus indeed. Newer areas are experimenting with big data in the area of forecasting, including sustainability and equality concerns into macroeconomic modeling, which I think is the area Simone is active in. Let me conclude. Macroeconomic models are far from perfect. There are efforts ongoing to improve them by working on better micro foundations, by having a realistic financial sector. No single model is good for everything. So we have different models for different types of questions, and sometimes you also use several models at the same time and see what kind of average outcome you get. We should continue learning from other disciplines. Behavioral economics and institutional economics have been doing that for some time. They are now mainstream. The exploration of big data and machine learning is probably the next step. And finally, despite all their limitations, economic models are useful. They are useful for forecasting. They are useful for scenario analysis and identifying imbalances earlier on. And you should never use a model without economic judgment behind it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I was particularly pleased by your first question. You ask yourself what is wrong with economic models. So this is a very necessary question if we wish to do any difference from what we have. And you ended with a very good sentence as well, learn from the others. We are discussing so complex and complicated issue. We added also artificial intelligence, which is a new element in the story. So thank you very much. And our next speaker is Professor Simone D'Alessandro, who is an associate professor at the Department of Economics and Management and vice director of the Interdisciplinary Center Science for Peace at the University of Pisa. I am pleased that his research is dedicated to the distribution of income and wealth, behavioral economics, ecological economics, sustainability, and degrowth. We are very curious, Professor. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, really a pleasure to be here. And I would like really to thank all the organizers, from Olivier, Philippe, and many others that make possible for the post-grow, degrow community to come here to debate about this issue. This is really a special place for us, so I hope that this conference will be fruitful for everybody. And the second thing that I would like to say is that I'm going to present a sort of model that really be built a bit on the presentation that Bjorn has done a few minutes ago, so this is really helpful for me. And this job was done together with myself and Tiziano Di Stefano and Andrzej Cieplinski from the University of Pisa and Christopher Dittmer that was working in Cogito, a think tank in Sweden. This project was partially funded by a group, so 4 members of European Parliament by the Green EFA group. So I also thank for them to make it possible to continue this research. That is important, and in particular, politician has the right question. The problem is often the models has not the possibility to answer to the difficult questions. So Philippe Lambert was asking us how it's possible to maintain high level of employment in a post-grow or low-grow economy. And this is a really difficult question for macroeconomists. And I really agree with Bjorn that a certain model can answer to some questions. It isn't possible to force the model to answer to everything. Okay, this is really important. So, for instance, if I would ask you, what is the most pressing issue economists today should be addressing, which would be your answer? I don't know. In 2017, this question was made a lot of, in a lot of schools, universities, and this is based on the CORE project. That is a new textbook to teaching economics in a different way, and that was the result. Okay, this is a word cloud. This means that the biggest word is the ones that most often appears from Bogota to London, from Brussels to whatever you want. And you see that the most interesting questions are inequality, unemployment, environment, poverty, sustainability. That was 2017, so there is Brexit. Okay? But if you try to look about growth, inflation, debt, this word is quite small. This does not mean that they are not important in the future of a macroeconomic model. We know that they're important, but people want to have some ideas to answer to these questions. And I think that our work is to find some model that can answer to this question, and I try to present a very simple, so very shortly, the work that we have done in the few years in order to try to address this question. So I don't want to spend time saying that climate change and inequality are important. We know from this morning. And one thing that we know that these, not only they are issues, but they are concrete threats to a contemporary standard of living. This is really important. And we have a lot of scientific report and publication that says that we really have the urgency to do something on climate change. But if you read also this very nice recent paper by Thomas Piketty, published this year, and to be honest, I think it's working paper now, that it says how inequalities is socially unsustainable. So, especially saying something here in this place where so we know that there will be the European election next year, we know that there could be very dangerous consequence for our democratic institution if we are not able to think something important about inequality. I think this is a big issue for us. So the idea of the model was really simple, was try to understand if we can provide a support for policies, okay, and also if some kind of strong policies that sometimes the community of the growth is proposing or the post-growth community is proposing. Come back a bit to the previous slide. So if they're usually deemed as unfeasible or economically economically infeasible or politically infeasible. So we think that is a matter of the ideas. So we can change the ideas and try to make this policy proposal also quite strong and different, a credible or a viable alternative. Okay, I don't want to spend much time on the literature, also because this morning Tim Jackson was here, so probably you know most of this work about ecological macroeconomics. The idea was to put together and to try to make a model that really take into account the consequence of social, economic, and environmental dimension. When I speak about taking into consideration, means something particularly, in the sense that, as Bjorn was explaining before, that there can be feedback between one dimension to the other one. We usually work in a different way. If you look at how the plan for energy transmission is made at the level of the national level, we have a sort of economic scenario that is given, okay, that is a sort of a scenario. So it's exogenous from the model. And you have to start to understand which are the policies to do the low carbon transition. But of course we know that if you imagine an economy that is producing 20% or 0% of fossil carbon gas emission, you are thinking to a completely different economy. It's very difficult to say that you are not capturing the feedback from the change in the structure of the economy to the GDP or the economic model, the demand side. So sometimes this connection remains behind the models, or we build a cascade of models in order to understand something, and probably we lose many important feedbacks. Okay, so system dynamics is helpful in doing this job, so we can try to represent what is going on in this model, just to have an overview of the model that we build. Okay, so we have an input-output matrix with 10 sectors, okay, that represent the industries of this economy. Then we have resources, in particular the energy resources that we share in 5 groups, like coal, oil, nuclear energy, and gas. Then we have 13 kind of heterogeneous agents divided by skills and also by what they do in the economy, in the sense that if they are employed, unemployed, inactive, retired, or if are capitalist. And then finally, there is government. Government, of course, is important because it can change through policies the economic reward, how is the distribution of economic reward in the society between these agents. So these are the kind of agents that we analyze in the model. What we do, we are looking to some indicators. We called here main economic factors, the first sphere, just because they are both indicator but also variable of the model that help us interact each other to the other variable of the model. So we have GDP, investment, and net export, consumption, this is the demand side, something about profits, wages, wealth, also some financial wealth between equities, bond, and so on. And on the other side, of course, we think that social factors are really important, and so we understand something about inequality through the Gini coefficient of this economy, the effect of automation, wage inequality, unemployment, of course. So social indicators are important, again, are interrelated with the others. And finally, we have environmental indicators that are not so many, but we have something about greenhouse gas emission, electrification, energy intensity, and total primary energy supply that clarify also this difference between efficiency and CO2 emission, what is really CO2 emission in the economy. Of course, the most important variable is innovation. Okay? Innovation matters in all the feedback that we have, almost. And this really changes the future of the model. So we have to understand how innovation works in the model itself. So we build these reference scenarios just to see what happens to the model in the future, given the actual policies, the actual social welfare system. And we saw that our numbers that we find are, for instance, the GDP growth is lower than the traditional, so what is traditional presented. This means quite supporting the idea that the growth will not be so high in European countries. Oh, sorry, I forgot to say that this model is applied to France. There is some special point about France, especially in the energy sector, but we can apply this model to different countries with some time. And of course, we have deficit GDP, so we can see many different variables. And unemployment in our reference scenario is going to increase much more than in traditional macroeconomic or mainstream models. And this is due mainly to technical progress, okay? Because also the increase in export is not enough to cover the reduction in internal demand due to an increase in unemployment. What is interesting is also there is some change in the composition of employment between low-skilled and high-skilled workers. And as you see, the middle skill is increasing much more than other group of workers. And okay, I prefer to go on just to say, okay, we build this model, we have these reference scenarios. If you look at the connection between the different variables, we have a quite complex system. Okay, the degree of complexity we can discuss a lot, but we have some feedbacks from all these dimensions that come in different time, and someone slowly, and something more fast, and something more strong. And what we do, we would like to see which is the impact of policies on this model. So the interest and the effort to build this model is to try to capture the rationale of the policies we can do. For instance, if really innovation is incentivating, that we have a sort of new productive revolution, how sometimes we can say, we know that there are some effects from the supply side, but also from the demand side. And so, for instance, we don't know exactly what happens to GDP, because, of course, labor force will decline a bit, wage will increase. So it's not exactly clear by the, I don't know, the system thinking or the link which is the result on the GDP. What is surprising is that in the simulation, GDP does not change so much. Okay, there is, of course, a composition of a different distribution of economic rewards inside the economy in favor, of course, to firms or profit in this case. Another different policy, just to see as an example of what we can do, what we have done with this model, think about job guarantee. So if we include job guarantee, a sort of like quite strong alternative policies, which is the result that we have, of course, job guarantee enters directly on the public expenditure, so we have an increasing deficit in the, of course, for the government, but at the same time we have some improvement in the labor demand, and this impact positively on the GDP. So again, this dynamic effect from the demand side and supply side are important, and we have to see them all together, in the sense that often, in some model, you see a dynamic only on one side, like in the supply side. Okay, so just to, very shortly, what we have done. So, of course, nobody is interested to a single policies. Nobody can say that doing basic income or doing a lot of innovation will solve inequality and climate change problems. Okay? So we have to think about some mix of policies. Which are these mixes? Okay, for the standard and mainstream approach to economics, and also in most of the institutions here in Brussels, green growth is the headline. What means the green growth in this macroeconomic model? It means that you can use automation, energy efficiency, and increase renewable energy sources. You try to change the energy mix in favor to electricity. These are the main pillars of green growth. Okay, so we try to make this mix of policies to see what happens in our model, and we compare this model, this scenario, with another one that we call policies for social equity, that make almost the same environmental policies of the green growth, means in particular the energy mix changing in favor to electricity, but we include a job guarantee program up to 30,000 workers per year with a wage equal to the minimum wage in France now, that is 10 euros and something, and a working time reduction of hours from 35 to 30 hours. Furthermore, we include carbon tax. In France, we already have a carbon tax, but beyond the 2030, and an introduction of carbon border adjustment. So the idea is try to compare these two scenarios. One is based in some of the post-growth community, so at least proposal, and the other one is based on what we usually think about the green growth process. Moreover, since we have in our post-growth conference, and we are sharing some idea of the growth, we think what happens if people realize that instead they can reduce their consumption because they think that this is an important climate change is an issue, or, for instance, because they realize that status consumption or consumerism is not really something useful for their well-being. And the result, of course, in order to do so, we introduce also a wealth tax that was not before, up to 2% of the wealth. So it's a lot in terms of welfare system, but of course it's not a lot if you think with respect to many other problems that we'll encounter without solving climate change. So I want to clarify that this reduction of consumption is not a policy. It's something like what happens if our community or the society can reduce the consumption of some degree, and we see what happens in the model. So I show some graph. There are just some few remarks about what we have in the comparison between these three scenarios. The first one is about GDP growth. As you can see, okay, so the blue in the next graph, there are not so many, a few of them, but just to clarify a bit the result. The blue line is what we call baseline or reference scenario. The red one is the green growth. The green is the policy for social equity, okay, and the green one is degrowth, okay. And you see, in terms of rate of growth, it's quite strange. So it's not strange, but of course, as I pointed out before, that green growth, policy for social equity, and the reference scenario has almost the same rate of growth. Not exactly the same, of course. In particular, the policy for social equity, since they work on the demand side, they have a bit higher rate of growth of the other. So degrowth scenario is really a degrowth scenario, so the rate of growth is negative. So if you look at the emissions, what we have is that the first important issue, so the reference scenario is not able, the blue line, to get the 20%. The 20% is the first horizontal line, 20% with respect to the 1990 level of CO2 emissions. So what is important to notice here is in terms of environment, the green growth and the policy for social equity have almost the same result. This means that if you think about green growth as the only strategy, we have other alternatives that are viable, and they probably do some job in terms of inequality or distribution or labor force, like we say the labor share in the economy. And for instance, and especially about, okay, so sorry, I forgot to say one important thing, that degrowth is the only one that in this representation goes below the 20%. It's not really important. Just to clarify that the reduction in consumption is necessary if we really want to decarbonize the economy. Otherwise, it seems very difficult that innovation by itself can obtain that result. Of course, what is much important is what happens in the social dimension. And if you look at unemployment rates, you see that the unemployment rates in the baseline or reference scenario in the green growth are increasing. In the green growth, they increase a bit more because automation matters and is stronger than before. While social equity, thanks to the job guarantee program, we reduce the unemployment rate very low, of course. Is exactly the directly impact that we want to realize. So it's nice also to see a decomposition of unemployment. Okay, and we know that the three colors reflect the number of unemployed for low, middle, and high skill level. And what is really the nice, so one of the important results that we have in terms of Gini coefficient about inequality. So in inequality dimension, you see that this is the Gini coefficient in percentage. It means that it starts around 34, 23. That is the result in France today. And you see that according to the green growth and the baseline, we expect an increase in inequality, while the degrowth scenario is the one that, of course, reduces a lot inequality, but at the same time also the policy for social equity scenario gain a very important and significant reduction in the Gini coefficient. Finally, you can see that these are not economically feasible from a deficit point of view. That is not completely true. Of course, the numbers can be thought in different ways. For instance, the policy for social equity case reached a sort of a bit below the 3.5% deficit in the ratio between deficit bill, probably a bit higher to the 3% target. But of course, it seems not something incredibly, I don't know, unfeasible from a political point of view, while the degrowth at the beginning has a higher deficit to GDP result, so then the situation changing thanks to the wealth tax. And okay, just to conclude, so if we are convinced that the struggle against inequality and climate change is really the most important things that we have to do, then I think that we have to start building some models that are able to take into consideration these aspects. And this means also to build something new, better, of course, than what I show here, but probably this model is, an attempt to cover a gap. That is to take into consideration the feedback between the social, the environmental, and the economic dimension. And I think that we have to stop to see technological progress as a panacea. Okay? So it is possible that technological progress solve a lot of problems, and we know it. Okay, nobody think that labor productivity is not an important variable, to have time to do many other things that we like to do. Okay? But of course, we have to be careful to believe that technical progress is a solution by itself. Then our model says that the change that we are they are required in order to meet these new objectives are much bigger than what we believe, in the sense that we cannot think to go to a no carbon economy, or low or no carbon economy, zero carbon economy, without changing almost everything what we know. Think about today, your day from this morning to now, and think to reduce your emission by zero. Okay. Of course, it means that it's a different economy, it's a different society. So we cannot think that our macroeconomic model that represents this change is some minor things that we have to do in our algorithm. It's not a minor thing, it's a new economic structure. So I think that this model is an attempt, of course. There can be other models that will be better than this one, but show that there are complementarities between social and environmental politics. And this, I think, is a quite important goal. So if you really think in a post-growth society, or we are sure that the rate of growth in the future will be lower for many different reasons, for the competition of other countries, because we think that planetary boundaries are important, then we know that we have to change, to have new institutions and change the distribution of economic rewards. So it is not possible to think that the distribution of economic rewards will be the same today and in 20 years have a low carbon economy. Okay, thank you very much. Mm-hmm.
So, thank you very much for your very, very interesting presentation. Later, I would be pleased if the time allows us to hear more about your concept of fairness. Our next speaker is Professor Daniel Mügge. He is there because he needs assistance. He is a professor of political arithmetic at the Political Science Department at the University of Amsterdam. In his research, he analyzes the political economy of macroeconomic indicators and the political origins of the formulas through which we calculate them. Floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I've moved over here because this presentation involves so much clicking that having to blush every 2 seconds is going to be highly distracting. I hope you'll be able to see me and maybe eventually, oh yeah, the cameras did already find me as well, so that works. Also, thanks from me for the invitation to speak here today. I want to shift our attention a little bit because so far we've basically talked about growth and models and different ways of thinking about our economy, always assuming that the basic data that we use, that the GDP figures, that the trade figures, that the unemployment figures, that the inflation figures, that those are basically rock solid, and the question is how much we should care about them. And what I want to convince you of that they're not nearly as rock solid as you may think. So, if the basic question of this session for me is, are our models fit for purpose, then I think there are 2 messages that I want you, when I'm done, to fold up, put in your pocket, take home with you. The first one is that, in spite of the things that we've heard, I think there is a lot of our economy widely conceived that remains under the model radar. And what that means is that economic models are not only simple, but they're systematically skewed in important ways because they ignore things that we know really to matter. And the second thing is that the economic data that we feed into these models is much poorer than we normally admit. And what that means is that what looks like objective analysis may potentially be built on quicksand. Now, the first one. I think it's important to understand that I'm not here to indict people who either build these models or use these models or make the data that feeds them. That's very important to me. So I think what I'm going to present to you today stems neither from incompetence nor from indifference or, for that matter, from myopia, that people, much maligned technocrats, that they don't know that there are things that matter to our well-being or to our economies that remain outside of their models. That's not the problem. So the statisticians, which is what I tend mostly to focus on, the world of statistics and economic indicators, what goes into them, they know all too well all the limitations of their data, right? And also I think that the ambition to say we want policy made here in Brussels that's not decided by the whims of autocrats or policymakers, but is on a solid foundation, I think that's a laudable ambition. I think that puts us, in principle, ahead of many societies. We have just one person, a man normally, sitting at the top of society, who just can go like this, say, okay, we need a bridge here, we need a road over there. So the question for us today is, I think, is to figure out whether the models and the data we use are actually up to the standards to which we want to hold them. Now, my first point. Our understanding of the economy, widely conceived, includes that there's a whole range of factors, and you see a bunch of them here on the screen, that we know to matter, broadly conceived, to the wealth of societies. They, of course, include something like the thing that you see there at the center in blue, the production and flows of money and other goods, but also things we heard about: geography, the international clout of a country. So, for example, what kind of trade agreements it is able to negotiate because it's big. Things like social cohesion, the degree of trust that there is in a society, government finances, innovation capacity, social values, what have you not. A whole host of things that intuitively we immediately understand to matter. Now, the point is this. The moment we start building a model, what happens is that these things start to drop out of the picture because many of them are very hard to force into a spreadsheet, to put into a single, clear, unambiguous, objective number. Statisticians typically don't want to stand accused of just making stuff up, putting too many value judgments in the spreadsheets. So many things drop out of the data, not because we don't know that they matter, but because they're kind of hard to model. So among other, these three things you tend to remain, and they get then put together, and that becomes our modeled economy. Again, not because we don't know that all of these other things don't matter, but because they're not easily modelable. That is the systematic myopia that is built into a lot of econometric thinking about the economy. Now the second point. I want to show you a few graphs here as an illustration of the poverty of a lot of economic data. Now, most recently I've been looking at international, so balance of payments data, trade statistics, investment statistics, all these sorts of things. And you'll immediately realize that a lot of the European economies, so even though I'm German, I'm based in the Netherlands, the exports and imports of the Netherlands, they are responsible for more than half of Dutch GDP. So what goes in and out of these countries is really important. The question is, how well are we even able to measure it? Because if we're not able to measure it well, then we have an extremely poor picture of what's even going on in our economies. Now, take one recently politicized example. This is the German trade surplus with the United States, at least according to the German figures, as they were supplied to the OECD. Now, if you ask the American statistics what their trade deficit with Germany is, it looks like this. What you see here is a difference over the recent years of a little less than $20 billion. This is all in American dollars. A difference of opinion about the annual merchandise trade deficit between Germany and the United States by $20 billion. Both of these are official figures, and both of these you'll find in official tables from the OECD. Now, lest you think that this is only one instance, I've also taken a few other of these examples. So, for example, the U.S. trade merchandise surplus with the Netherlands. Obviously, the overall volume is smaller because the Netherlands is a smaller country. But again, you see that, say, for example, in 2012, the American estimate was almost twice as high of the trade surplus with the Netherlands than what Dutch figures told us. Anybody who knows what the real number is and what's actually happening economically, feel free to tell me. Finally, then, I think that's most shocking. So forget the transatlantic business. Look at what's happening across a single land border, namely between Germany and the Netherlands. This is what the two countries have to say about their mutual trading relationship. This is what the official Dutch figures say in turquoise about the Dutch trade surplus with Germany. The German figures are in purple here. These are official statistics. Ask a German official, they'll give you the purple numbers. Ask a Dutch person, they'll give you the turquoise numbers. Now that serves as an illustration of how much vagary there is. Some of these reasons are easily understood. Let me give you just one example. The moment a DVD player arrives from a Chinese ship in the Rotterdam harbor, it's registered in the Netherlands as an import from China, then it's being exported back to, say, Düsseldorf or somewhere. So there is an import and an export. The Germans, when the thing arrives in Düsseldorf, they'll just see an import from China and never an import from the Netherlands, even though the Dutch register it as an export from the Netherlands to Germany. This is one small fraction of the kind of thing that's going on, but you get all sorts of distorting effects with the end result that we don't really know what's going on here. That's the state of the economic data that we have. Now, let me give you one other example here from a different domain. We also do work on public debt, so government debt. And, in Brussels, I don't need to remind anybody that if your debt is out of line, you can get into serious trouble here. And obviously we compare countries with each other, how they perform. And one of the key elements in trying to gauge what is actually government debt, what is not, has to do with pensions. Pension liabilities that governments have, most immediately to their own employees, but also the promises that they have made to their own citizens. Of course, if you make a promise to pay somebody something in the future, that counts as a liability. Now, so I've just compared two countries. I don't want to bombard you with too many graphs here, but this is comparing France and Canada and the government debt as a percentage of GDP. This is the picture according to the official statistics without pensions included. And what you see is that France is performing consistently worse than Canada. This is the kind of data that you get. You say, oh, yeah, France isn't doing all too well. If you just add in the pensions to which the Canadian government has already committed, it looks like this. And all of a sudden, systematically, Canada scores a lot higher in its debt and liabilities than does France. The point here is very simple, that concepts that look extremely solid, you're like, oh yeah, government debt, sure. And somebody gives you some number, they're not nearly as concrete and as solid as you might think. Now, what's going on here? essentially, you could say that many of these economic indicators, so the same goes for GDP, but we've talked about that enough already that I figured I'd give you something else, that these indicators were made for an old world. And when I say old world, I mean a world that effectively looked like this, where you have clearly demarcated national economies that are internally pretty homogeneous. You have like a container. Stuff goes on inside, and there's a clear border, and stuff that crosses the border counts as an external relationship. Of course, in the new world in which we live today, more than ever before, our economies look more something like this. And so what do we see, for example? We have a denationalization of economic production. A huge chunk of global trade happens inside of multinational enterprises. Volkswagen shipping dashboards to the United States. What's the value of that? What's the trade contribution of this Volkswagen dashboard? Well, it turns out, it's quite up to Volkswagen itself to decide what price tag it puts on that when it reports these things to the customs officials, depending on what's most advantageous in terms of tax and these sorts of things. So this transfer price, it makes it really hard to get a handle on, in quantitative terms, what's actually being traded around the globe. The same thing is true for ownership structures, who owns what. As again, people in Brussels know, luckily during the debates over the past years, we've talked a lot about that. There are opaque holding structures. The digital economy becomes extremely hard to measure. What's the value of Google Maps on your phone and how should that be geographically located? Intangible assets become ever more important in the production that are located on some offshore island. Sky-high derivatives trading makes it extremely hard to gauge who, where geographically actually holds which kinds of risks. And secrecy jurisdiction, of course, the whole point of them is to funnel away things in a way that becomes totally unclear who owns and does what. What that means is that the data that we have about our economy is not at all as hard as we would like it to be, and of course the results we get from that is neither. Now, final substantive point here. Not only has the global economy and its structure changed, but our societies have changed as well. When I said earlier that these indicators were made for an old world, that's basically a world in which men did factory work, so think your 1950s, from 8 in the morning to 6 at night, roughly, 5 or 6 days a week, and women were basically thought to be being at home, supplying the family, and, working, doing what some people would call reproductive labor within the household. Production basically meant production of stuff that you could put in the suitcase and take home with you, and living standard basically meant consumption of said stuff. Now, in the new world, of course, we have completely different labor markets with flexible working conditions, loads of people, ever more people being self-employed, have several part-time jobs. Standard unemployment statistics have a rather poor handle on this new labor world. Production often is intangible. I just mentioned 4 free apps on your smartphone, which make a huge difference to our lives, but are super hard, again, to put into a GDP calculation. Living standards, for many people, now transcends just consumption of stuff. So indicators on the left-hand side that used to work pretty well, unemployment statistics, GDP statistics, inflation statistics, don't work nearly as well to capture how we as citizens experience and live our lives in 2018. So these things are not only hard, but often impossible to measure, which means that the quality of the data decreases, and there is what you could call a growing measurement experience gap for citizens. Because we continue to measure things as if we still lived in the left-hand side world, even though many people have moved to the right-hand side world and feel misread and misunderstood by official statistics. Now, you could say then, in essence, that there is a growing gap in economic statistics between, on the one hand, the sense that the use and air of accuracy, that's actually increasing, where at the same time globalization in particular actually nags away at the quality of our statistics. Now, what does that mean? Here are my takeaway messages. I think we need to build further awareness of the reductionism that's in our models. Effectively, we need to take them with a bigger grain of salt. We should also critically evaluate the models and the data that feeds them for inbuilt biases, for things that they systematically ignore, not because people don't know that they matter, but because we can't adequately put them into a quantitative model. I think we need to reevaluate, and we should value much more highly trust and experience and basic insight that people have. So if you walk around a town that feels really run down, you have the sense that something is wrong, I don't think you need to wait for some complicated model to tell you that, yes, things really are wrong here, then things are pretty wrong. You often have the impression that there is a demeaning of just our basic human insights from people who have lots of experience, and we still need to wait for the model results to tell us, oh yeah, we have a problem here. And finally, I think, and that's what we're doing here today, I think there is also scope to educate policymakers about the data limit and effects, such that we can come to a more balanced way of assessing what it is that we can take from economic models and what we can't. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have the intention to comment many of your statements, but I will just tell that I'm pleased by your considerations on the limitations or limits of the models and about the reductionist paradigm we use when we use models or define models. Thank you. And now we have two more speakers. The next one is Dr. Arthur Turrell. Is a research economist at the Bank of England, working at the interface of economics and techniques borrowed from science, including machine learning and agent-based modeling. He has recently published papers on the need for more interdisciplinary approaches to macroeconomic modeling. Please.
Okay, thank you. What an honour it is to be here and talk on this exciting topic, or I think it's very exciting anyway. So, as the introduction said, I'm a research economist at the Bank of England, but my background is actually in physics. So, in some ways, I'm a bit of an outsider to economics, and hopefully I'm bringing a kind of different perspective. What I want to tell you about today is how I think macroeconomic models could benefit from drawing on a wide range of academic disciplines, not just physics. And I also want to tell you about how we're actually trying to put this into practice at the Bank of England. And you've heard a little bit here about some of the exciting things that are going on in macroeconomic modelling to try and bring in more. And all of that is great stuff, and you'll probably hear a few things that you've heard already. Can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So if you want to find out more, there's an article which I published with the Bank of England's chief economist earlier in the year, which you can check out, or you can check me out online as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So my kind of thesis is that actually existing macroeconomic models have been really useful, and I think they were described earlier as the workhorse. They're certainly the workhorse of central banks and how we think about macroeconomics, and that's fantastic. But I think that we could do better, even better, by widening the pool of models that we use. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And I think the way to do it is to look for actually complementary models. So these are models which extend our knowledge in new directions. So great, we've got some of the stuff that we've already done covered, but there's lots of gaps in our knowledge, as we just heard. And I think actually other academic disciplines are one of the places that we can look to try and find these new approaches. And I don't just mean how we actually perform the model, but actually also how we talk about models as well, and how we communicate about the modelling that we're doing as economists to the general public, which is almost as important as actually doing the modelling itself. So you might say, well, actually, economics is already got all of these interfaces with all of these other academic disciplines. Why do we need to pay more attention to what's going on in the outside world? Also, economists are really smart, surely they know everything. Well, sadly, that's not true. It's certainly not true of me. And actually, the evidence suggests that economics, if anything, has been too insular. So this plot here shows over quite a long period of time the number of citations to other subjects from a particular subject, shown in the bubbles, and from other subjects to that subject. So not only are economists are in the wrong part of this plot. Not only are they being cited less frequently than most other disciplines, they're also citing other disciplines less frequently than other disciplines. And that seems very strange to me. I think that's puzzling on two counts. One is that, as I said, economists don't know everything, and actually there's a lot to learn from other disciplines. And another is that economics does actually touch on lots of different areas of life. I'd actually disagree with the point about scope earlier. Actually, I think, economics has a scope which leads it to interface with welfare broadly defined, obviously what's going on in the macroeconomy, but also lots of things in the social sciences, lots of things in health as well. So I don't think it's right that economists should be more self-referential than physicists or mathematicians. That seems wrong to me. And I think next slide, please. There are some ways, particularly in which macroeconomics has been perhaps too insular in the past. So although the pre-crisis models that we were using, which were mentioned earlier, largely centered around dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, are really good in some respects, there are some things which are missing from them and which suggest that we need a kind of wider or deeper gene pool. And if you could just go forward to the first bullet, one of the most glaring kind of omissions, if you like, from these models as they were pre-crisis was there wasn't really an explicit role for finance. So they couldn't explain how a large financial crisis could start or how it could propagate. Now, obviously, that was a big problem in the crisis, and I'm happy to say that there's work going on to try and fix that now. They also assumed a world that was full of everything was normally distributed, okay? So there were never kind of outliers or black swan events, and there were only ever small disturbances from equilibrium. But actually we know, or at least sometimes the world looks like it's actually behaving more non-linearly, and that it has kind of fat-tailed distributions where outliers occur. And actually, ideally, we'd like a model which can capture that. So if you go on to the next bullet. The other thing is that these models assumed that individuals were completely rational in the way that they make decisions. Now, I doubt that's true of anyone in this room, and it's certainly not true of me. And sometimes that doesn't matter. It's a really strong assumption that everyone is rational, they're able to compute all of their future actions and everyone else's future actions. There are occasions where perhaps that assumption is justified, but there are many occasions where the assumption is not justified, for instance, with the development of bubbles and so on. So actually, I think this is out of line with the evidence on people's actual behaviour, and there are some important lessons that we might learn by incorporating more realistic behaviour. Additionally, these models didn't have a role for unpredictable uncertainty, so so-called Knightian uncertainty as opposed to kind of risk. So unknown unknowns, in the words of Donald Rumsfeld. And I think that's a problem as well, because for most of us, day by day, the future is truly uncertain. And the final thing that I kind of think was wrong with these, sorry, not wrong, or rather, we should be looking to other models to kind of fill in the gaps for, is that everything was aggregate as well. So we'd have perhaps one aggregate household representing all households in the economy. We would have one representative firm representing all firms. Now, for some questions, that works fine. But if you want to look at, say, distributional effects of policies, then it's completely useless. And we need to look to other types of models. We heard about an interesting one earlier. So I think the fact that we couldn't answer all of the policy questions that we wanted to with these models was a bit of a problem. Now, you could say, hey, this doesn't matter. As long as the models do well, what does it matter what the assumptions are? But the reality is that the models didn't do that well at a time when actually we needed them the most. At a time when the economy was going through some very rapid changes, 10 years ago now. And actually, so what we've got here in this plot is the year-on-year GDP growth for the UK, the 2015 data vintage there, but also in purple there, the Bank of England's inflation report forecast in November 2007. So we and all of the other economic forecasts for the UK were in a pretty tight range there of 1 percentage point. How did we do? Well, can we move on to the next slide and just have a look? Yeah, not terribly well. And this is a problem. And there are kind of two problems here. One is obviously that no one foresaw how deep the reduction in growth was going to be, and that's a problem. And there are some arguments which say, well, actually, these very, very large one-off shocks, maybe you can't predict them, because if you could, then you would have taken action to stop them. And there's probably some truth to that argument. But also worrying is the fact that the models were so homogeneous. It wasn't like 3 or 4 of the models were predicting something bad was going to happen. None of them were. So I think what we need are different types of models to help us do better in the future. And actually, as well as the kind of arguments about performance and about the kind of assumptions that we're making that mean we need to expand our modelling landscape, there are some good, if a little more abstract, arguments for why we might want to do it. So the first is the kind of economic argument, actually, which is about competition and complement. You know, we want to have lots of different models telling us different things. You know, models are all kind of they're idealized representations of the real world. We can't put the whole of the real world into one model. So inevitably, we're going to make different modeling choices at different times to answer different questions, and that's absolutely fine. And if we have two models which disagree, that's actually really interesting. We might want to work out why that is. And if lots of models do agree, then we might start to think, well, actually, if lots of very different models agree, then we might start to get more faith in what they're saying. There's also a scientific argument here as well, which is that, you know, in macroeconomics, it's a pretty bad idea to do experiments. We shouldn't be doing experiments, clearly. And this means that it's very hard to apply that scientific method where we choose our models based on what gave us the best prediction of reality in an experiment. We can't do it at all. So I would say we've actually got a problem of weak selection of models. And in a world where you've got weak selection of models, the best you can do is have a lot of different models with different assumptions. And what I've kind of argued for previously is that what we need is a kind of Cambrian explosion. If you could just go back one, sorry. Is a kind of Cambrian explosion. So this is a metaphor from biology and evolutionary history, where we kind of fill in a lot of the ecological niches in the modelling space with different types of modelling. Okay, so that's kind of what I think should happen. It's very easy to call for change. It's very difficult to actually do it. So I'm going to suggest now in this next slide some of the ways in which I think that the modelling community as a whole can try and take new approaches which draw heavily on other disciplines, and indeed the ways in which we're trying to do this at the Bank of England. And by the way, I forgot to give the usual disclaimer at the start, so let me give it now. These are actually my views and not those of the Bank of England. But what I'm featuring here is the kind of work that I've been doing there. So we're really interested in new types of models which are kind of similar in some ways to the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, but which capture human behavior from the bottom up. So we get rid of this idea of the representative household, and we instead think, well, actually, we know what the distribution of people is like across the country or across different educational levels. Let's try and simulate them almost on an individual basis. Now, these techniques are taken actually originally from physics, where they've been very successful and long established. They've been around since almost since the dawn of the computer age in the 1950s and 1960s. And they work very well there, and we've had some success applying them to problems. I've had some success applying them in problems to my own work, and there's a really rich literature on macroeconomic agent-based models that's starting. One of the things that we've been looking into more recently, one of the things that we were advised to look into as part of a review process, was actually to have some more statistical models as well. Now, of course, statistical models are only good if the future looks a bit like the past. That's not always true, which is why we have these non-statistical models as well. But actually, there's some interesting things going on in statistical models. We can draw on the amazing work that's going on in computer science and machine learning. And, you know, in many cases, the models that we have already, which are statistical, will do just as well. But there may be some areas, some benefits that we can get from new types of machine learning model. That's something I'm working on. There's a plot of that on the right-hand side here. And for instance, one of the things that we think that the machine learning models might be better at is modeling turning points and capturing some of those nonlinearities. Traditionally, the statistical models used in economics are linear. Okay, so we've heard a little bit earlier as well about behavioral economics and psychology and the amazing things that have gone on in those fields over the last 2 or 3 decades. And actually, I think some of those discoveries, if you like, or theories have yet to really break through into macroeconomic modelling. It's starting, and there's some fantastic work out there, but it's not quite reached the kind of workhorse models yet. So I think we could do more there, drawing on psychology. In my own work, I've used big data sets to try and inform models which look at more granular level detail of what's going on in the economy. There's a plot there of the labour market tightness by region in the UK. That's something that we haven't been able to look at before. But what we found by looking at the data is that the regional labour market tightness and other qualities of the labour market really affects the aggregate rate of job finding. So it's actually really important to take notice of these things. And it's not only in our work that we're trying to branch out and draw on other disciplines, we're also hiring staff. So I'm there from physics. We also have staff from computer science, from linguistics, from psychology, from mathematics, from data science. We have economic historians as well, really trying to bring together a melting pot to try and expand the way that we use models. Now, I have also said that I think there's an important angle here, which is not just how we actually do models, but it's also how we talk about models as well. You may have heard, next slide please, you may have heard recently that British politician Michael Gove said that Britain has had enough of experts. And if those experts are economists, this YouGov poll certainly makes for reading which agrees with that. It says that economists are not trusted by almost every demographic in UK society. And that's a real challenge for us. You know, we can do the fanciest model in the world, but if people don't trust us, then, you know, that's a real problem for people having faith in institutions which do economics. And in fact, we've done some research which suggests that only 1 in 10 of the population think that public figures talk about economics in an accessible way. And I think that's a real challenge to us. But not only, I think, can we look to other disciplines for how to actually construct our models, I think we can also look for how to communicate our models as well. So if we go on to the next slide, what I've put here is the net trust in scientists. Now, science is not economics, okay? So often with economics, people come with their own priors. No one's coming with their own priors to physics about the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. So they are very different. And that's fine. But I think that means that economists actually have to work harder than scientists in communicating their ideas to the general public. And scientists do an amazing amount of stuff to try and reach out and tell people about why what they're doing is important. And I think we should be doing more of the same. And that means talks, it means maybe documentaries, it means engagement. It means pushing the consensus view where it exists on topics which do have genuine wide agreement. And it means doing better communication of the problems with models and the limitations. For instance, you know, I think the weather is a fantastic example. So, you know, the predictions for what's going to happen with the weather come from solving huge simulations on supercomputers of systems of partial differential equations which ingest data from all over the world. And yet, you know, you take it for granted when you see it on the evening news and someone says, oh, there's a 20% chance of rain tonight. You know, I think we could really learn something from what's going on there. And indeed, if we go on to the next slide, I'll tell you again about how we're trying to put some of these ideas about communicating models into action. So that includes, I'll be quick because I know I've run over. So that includes visual summaries of the policy decisions that we make. It includes sending economists to talk to real people on their own turf. It even includes experiments looking at how we can communicate better. And one thing I've said before is, why not create a chair for the public understanding of economics like we have for the public understanding of science? Okay, well, that's all I wanted to say. Hopefully I've convinced you that we can do a lot better by drawing on different disciplines for macroeconomics.
Thank you very much, Dr. Turrell. We still like to hear voices from London. And I still don't believe in Brexit, if I may share this with you. I'm particularly pleased that you presented your ideas in the context of the crisis. I will certainly remember your notion, communication of uncertainty. This is not a very popular attitude among politicians, but we have to deal with them. So, thank you. Our last speaker, I like particularly, I would say, bienvenue, Madame Nicole Dewandre, because I like philosophers, and she does not work at the European Commission only and has been part of Jacques Delors' think tank before focusing on science and society issues. She is currently a researcher in philosophy and political theory in the Joint Research Centre. And I would like to say that before founding fathers of the European Union agree on the first treaty on community on steel and coal, they were discussing the concept of man, and there was a certain philosophy at the beginning, and without philosophy we will not agree on very successful new models. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Peterle. And I will follow Daniel's example. I'm here. Does the camera shift or not? Yes, it does. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation and this possibility to share with you the work I'm doing in the JRC. And as other panelists, I have to say that also my views are personal and do not necessarily reflect the one of the Commission. So I'm working on language and concept, and we have built a tool inside the Commission who crawls, a computational language tool who analyzes all the documents that are put on the EURLEX repository. So that's 8,695 reference from 85, running from 85 to 2017. In these 7,000 plus documents, economic is the key word. That means the word with particular pregnancy in salience, I would say, in a text. Economic is the first, top, most frequent keyword appearing in our document. So I find interesting, compared to the insularity of economic science, as a science that was mentioned by the predecessor speaker, the previous speaker, to see that in the EU policy document, indeed, economic is at its core narrative. Now, when you look at economic model, then it's much, much smaller. Then you have only 6 texts, out of which this economic model or economic model there is none, so appears as keyword. So that means we don't speak by economic models. So we use them, as was explained by Bjorn, but we don't mobilize them in the narrative about policy making. So that's important to know also. Now, the word model on its own has, as we all know, a dual signification. On the one hand, it is descriptive. It is a representation of a person or a thing or a proposed structure on a smaller scale. It's not saying here reduction in the sense of reductionist, but smaller scale. So this descriptive dimension, but also it's used as it's a thing used as an example to follow or imitate. It's normative. And here I want to pick on the comment made by Bjorn saying models should not be ideal, they are just tools. I want to say it's never just a tool. Of course, a tool is not neutral. To a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And in fact, it's between ideal and mere tool, you have this thing which is called a framing, that the way you represent things, of course, induce and impact the way you think and act. And this is the metaphor I want to suggest, that words are like magnets. When you utter a word, it creates a semantic field. It conditions the solution space, I would say, that you create to the problem you describe. For example, to take a very basic thing which is often used also in EU policy documents, we insist on the speed of change. When you characterize change, which can be characterized in many ways, by its speed, you focus on the need to hurry up for the solution. And as was said in the morning, at one point you cannot hurry up even more, or if the Philharmonic Orchestra keeps playing quicker, I found this very funny metaphor, an interesting one, it's not the point. But that shows that the way we characterize a problem conditions the solution that seems to make sense. Now, this has been put forward by Georges Lakoff, of course, in this very important and influential book of The Metaphor We Live By, to realize that the words are not just a sort of description, a neutral description of a reality, but in the political, the words we use matter a lot. And I want to put forward Hannah Arendt, which before Lakoff, we have to say, made the link between the way we speak, the metaphors, and the way we think, the conceptual thought. Now, and we heard a lot of interesting metaphor, growth as cancer by Mr. Peterle, this braderie, economy and braderie by Mrs. Margaret Vestager, or Bjorn when he mentioned the zoo. I think that indeed when someone brings a metaphor, we quickly see, does it make sense? Does it help us thinking and act and change? Or it does not make sense. So that's a recognition that we can do very quickly. Now, this is a word by Hannah Arendt. She places speaking and words at the heart of of what she thinks is the political. And she writes, power, and it's important to know that she distinguished power from force. So for her, power is not a force, and from violence. So she says power is actualized only where words are not empty and deeds not brutal, where words are used to disclose realities and deeds to establish relations and create new realities. So here, it's very important, I think, that part of the crisis we have and the critique I'm doing of the EU policy discourse is to some extent words are being emptied. The way the policy discourse are sometimes empty. Why? Why is it so? So, we have found, and I'm happy to salute Ursula Gulias here in the room, we did a critical metaphor analysis of strategic document covering the period from Delors' single market and until the EU 2020 strategy by Barroso II. So these 6 documents cover the range from Delors I Commission to Barroso II Commission. And we have identified that in these documents presenting the overall strategy of the Commission, there is a sensitive inversion. What do we mean by that? The sensitive inversion is that we speak, EU policy documents speak of business as if business were sensitive beings when they are functional. And they speak of people who are sensitive as if they were functional. So people are labor force, they lack skills, or they are consumers. It's really a partial way, a functional way to speak of people. And the business are to be encouraged, they are to be supported, they need to be fit to be competitive. So the way we speak of business, that's not how we study them through models, but the way we speak about business is to make them personae and sensitive personae. That's one conceptual key that, of course, may explain why when you read the text, if you're a lobbyist, you like it because you are working for a person who is recognized as such. But if you feel as a person yourself, you feel you're not recognized as a sensitive being yourself. Size matters in another problem. We insist a lot about the fact that big is better, and that when things are fragmented and small, it's not good. But that means that the people we are asking to make decisions in the name of size feel that they are too little themselves, and that the end point is to disappear into a bigger whole. So when we insist on size to justify policies, we neglect the importance of relationality between those on the European agora who do politics together. So I think that this insistence on size is problematic. And also in economics, because we are here in a session about economic models, we know there are economies of scale, but there is also a diminishing margin of returns. And paradoxically, this side of economic theory is never, I would say, mobilized. Now, deficit framing is the fact that we always, and not only, I think, in policies circle, but elsewhere as well, describe the present in terms of what is broken. The present is broken, the future is bright. There are promises, be it because of innovation or revolution, you choose, but it's always better tomorrow. And with that, we keep describing the present in terms of what is wrong, and the day after, instead of saying, oh, yeah, indeed, it's much better, no, we do it again, because tomorrow is the today of that day. And the last conceptual key, as we called it, is speed is of the essence, and this I alluded to earlier already, that, of course, because the present is broken, we should get out of it as soon as possible, so let's hurry up. But when we hurry up, there is a prize for hurrying up. That means that people are not asked to think and act together, but just to follow those who would know better than others what needs to be done. So I think all this is anchored into, and that's my key point, my take-home message would be that to realize that all this makes sense because we have embraced this fundamental representation of what an agent is. That means we consider that we are rational subjects. Agents are rational subjects. There is an upper version of the rational subject, Archimedes with his lifting the earth, which is the guy that the objective that he has, he can reach it provided he has a means. So the means being power, money, knowledge, you choose, but whatever objective is attainable provided there is a means. And the lower version of the rational subject is the guy who is compliant. And it's interesting to see that the word subject, both in English and in French, I didn't study other language, so, but have a dual meaning. The subject in front of a king is in the down position, but in front of the object, he's in upper position. But both these figures share the fact that they are alone. The upper version, the lower version, they are alone. And it's all about control. You're either in control or under control. So control is the obsession of the rational subject. And in the policy text, when we are providing transparency, for example, that's a need that speaks to the upper version of the rational subject. And flexibility is the need that speaks to the lower version of the rational subject. I would say the rational subject, conceptually wise, is an uncompromising, disembodied and unrelated individual. He fears being in control while seeking to control others, so always in this paradoxical and trade-off tension, sort of. His freedom is his autonomy, which means etymologically an absence of relation. So we have to think the extent to which what makes sense in our mind is related to the fact that we have this rational subject as a proxy for what it is to be human or a business or whatever. I have looked at more recent texts to see are we in transition. And it's interesting to see that this college has a sense of the fact that this transparency and control is not so much grasping what really is needed. So we see appearing an increasing use of words which are slippery. I agree, of course, but an increased use of the word fair, trust, resilience, for example. Why do I take this as a sign of, but first, let's say that when you look at growth here, to be sure, it's much higher still. So there is a long way to go because the footprint of the word growth is still very high on our document in general. But I think that this is a moment now to the increase of trust, fairness and resilience is interesting because these words are just alien to the mind of the rational subject. A rational subject doesn't need to trust. He can control. He doesn't need to be treated fairly, no problem. So these words show that we realize that the proxy of rational subject is not a good proxy anymore. And not only not a good proxy, I would go as far as saying it's a toxic proxy. So it's not that we should say, okay, it's reductionist, but it's not just one reduction among others. It's a reduction that is becoming, as we speak, more toxic every day. We know that science has produced toxic knowledge with eugenics or with some things about women was said in the name of science that is now completely accepted as wrong. I think that at this moment we have to make the distinction between what in the economic corpus is a sound knowledge and what is a toxic knowledge. Now, and that's why Arendt has a solution, I think, in the human condition. She described the human condition in a way that can now be mobilized to substitute to this rational subject proxy. She says that we are organic. So the rational subject, he was disembodied. Here, she first recalled that we are organic beings with basic needs, with survival needs. And as long as we have ensured our survival, this is what she called the labor. This is an activity which is driven by necessity. Okay. We are also rational. So it's not that we are not rational. We are not shifting from being rational to being irrational. No, we are rational. We have strategic abilities. And when we do an object, when we realize something that we have envisaged, it corresponds to what we have anticipated, we are a maker. And instead of being this guy alone, either under control or in control of everything, we are plural. She wrote, men in the plural inhabit the earth, not men with a big M and in the singular. And this plurality is the bundle of equality. We spoke a lot about inequality here, but we are also equal to some extent. We are unique while being equal. And we have identities that reveal themselves in the way we act. So it's not true that we have identity that we control, as we think when we are a rational subject. Our identities, whether we like it or not, reveal themselves by the way we act. And I think that this is often denied now in the political discourse and should be remembered. So when you have this in mind, you shift, you get rid of the rational subject, and you consider relational selves as the proxy, the concept from which you think what is good for agents. So the relationality comes from the fact that because we are organic, there are things we need to stay alive. Because we are maker, there are things we need to realize what we want, and because we are plural, we have to act with others to reveal who we are and to allow them to reveal who they are by our recognition of their action. And the selves, they are not torn apart between am I in control or am I under control. As selves, we are all vulnerable. And a lot of what happens is justified or acted by powerful people or so-called powerful people who protect themselves from their own vulnerability. So I think that the vulnerability is really a shared characteristic and that we should acknowledge this vulnerability, the fact we have who identities and we are interdependent. So with relational selves as a concept, you see that you're not deemed to be either coherent, you don't need necessarily to add a layer to redress the reductionism of the Homo economicus. But with the relational self, you really come to the type of thought that we heard today on the panel, but also I wanted to, because these books, I think are really going in this direction of a new way of thinking and sort of opening our eyes, waking up from this era where we had our eyes closed or totally focused on this rational subject proxy, and it's now increasing toxicity. So I want to, Donut Economics, for example, she calls Kate Raworth for this being agnostic about growth. So not say necessarily that we need to go from pro-growth to pro-degrowth, but to go to be agnostic about growth and justify the action under the other goals. So which are social, it can be inequalities and, for example, and environmental standards. And the same with Mariana Mazzucato, who calls for stopping to confuse price with value and make the difference between who is making the wealth and who is taking the wealth. So in conclusion, I want to put forward this sentence from Arendt again. Humans are not born in order to die, but in order to begin. And with that, we heard from Tim Jackson this morning that the Earth is not limitless. The Earth is not limitless, but the future is. And I think that sometimes we should be aware not to mix or to confuse our own future as human beings, who is limited by our own death, of course, and the future as an era. So I think the future is open, but the Earth, in fact, the Earth is limited as it is a sphere, as we know now. But in modern times, they did also rediscover it at that time. So now, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the debate.
Thank you very much, Madame Dewandre. It was really philosophical. And thank you also for presenting those two names. In the end, I think that both authors are very good thinkers, and I am particularly thankful to you for explaining a little bit the relational aspect of the story, because I think it is missing. I didn't study philosophy, but I think that I understand a little bit what does it mean to be relational or not to be. So now we're lucky to have 17 more minutes to discuss what was said, but first I would like to invite panelists to exchange thoughts to each other if there was something what provoked somebody. So this is first debate among you, and then we will open the debate to the audience.
In view of the short,
Pardon?
in view of the short time that is remaining, maybe.
I think I've heard enough from me.
Yeah.
Enough? Okay, then it's your turn. Please tell who you are and be as short as possible.
Thank you. I'm Nick Mabey. I run an environmental non-profit called E3G. 2 questions, don't have to all answer them. I used to be a macroeconomic modeler in the early 90s. Most of these presentations could have been given then. There's been very little progress, despite the amazing technical progress in the tools and some of the data, shall we say, the quantity of data. Why? What's the cultural thing that's getting in the way of actually this happening? Because every other discipline I've worked in since then has evolved enormously in the way it's used information data modelling in that period. It's not that we weren't thinking like this. Second one, the European Commission is about to do, or is in the process of doing, a 2050 roadmap to see how Europe gets to a zero-carbon economy. In that modelling of the economy, it won't include climate damages in the baseline going to 2050 or 2070. One, do you think that's a good choice? And two, how would you include climate damages in that macro model this year? Because that's a pretty important part of making a choice about whether net zero is feasible, which is the question they've been asked.
Thank you. Let's collect some questions and comments, please.
Patrick Bicheri from the National Bank of Belgium. I had a question more for Simone D'Alessandro. Thank you for your model. It should be something really impressive as work. Let's imagine 2 seconds that we are not talking about France but about Italy. Then I understood that this should be one country model with closed economy. What happens with if you are in an open economy with competitive pressure from outside, for instance, China? And second question, and last one, what happens with public debt dynamics if you imagine that you are thinking about introducing a basic income and that your financial markets are reacting badly from the beginning, then maybe that your public finance development won't be so soft. Thank you.
Thank you. So, lady behind, I think you asked for the floor. No? So, please.
Nicholas Ashford from MIT. If you step back a minute, the most difficult model is simply one which is the supply and demand model. And there are 3 things wrong with it which we've not addressed. One is that all of the factors that explain industrial production do not carry the full freight in terms of environmental damage and human damage. So and I understand there's another session dedicated to the question of externalities. The second problem is that the factors of production that we do use disadvantage employment. Labor is not owned by the capitalists, and they cannot rent it. And the continual movement towards the elimination of labor as a factor of production has now produced a crisis in demand. We have plenty of cash. The banks are awash with it. Productive capacity cannot meet what is not a real informed demand. And the third is that the rules of finance, and somebody did mention finance, which are unregulated, favor the owners of capital. My brother reminds me that nobody ever really got wealthy by working, they got wealthy by owning. And the corollary of that is we get poorer and poorer by working rather than by opening the mechanisms of owning like the banks have. So the supply and demand model is a fiction, and yet all public policy is based on basically making sure supply and demand are so in equilibrium. That's a major failure that you haven't addressed.
Thank you. Please. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Anna Margarida Esteves, formerly from the European Commission, now a researcher at the University Institute of Lisbon. I have 2 questions. The first one is about the concept of scarcity, which seems to be one of the buzzwords which have kind of characterized and supported research and communication of research results in economics for the past decades. Which criteria did you use to define scarcity? Because this is a concept which is highly contestable. Scarcity according to what? to whom? How can we define abundance in contrast to scarcity? So this is the first question. The second question is to Mrs. Dewandre. It's about overcoming this kind of what you call the lower version of the rational agent. This approach to so-called rational agency is based on an attempt to eliminate from economic thinking and also from policy making any trace of values and norms which can be traced back to religious thought or to any idea of transcendence which can be contestable. So in order to achieve that kind of lower common denominator according to which all agents in a pluralistic democratic polity could identify with, we ended up falling into this rut. So how can we somehow transcend that reductionism, that dehumanizing reductionism, and implement an idea of a rational agent or post-rational agent in the model which is proposed by Hannah Arendt in a way that values the human as such, but without falling into any type of quasi-religious thought or any kind of dogma. Thank you.
So last question in the first round.
Thank you. It's red.
It is?
Yes, it is.
It's red. Christian Felber from Economy for the Common Good. I have two questions to Mr. Döhring. The first is that you said that an apple bought at the grocery store or the supermarket has the same effect on well-being as a self-grown apple. My first question is if this is your personal experience or if you think that economists think so. If you think that economists think so, do you think that they talk from personal experience? And do you consider a person that says, to me it makes a huge difference if the apple is bought at the supermarket or self-grown, and non-economist? And my second question is, considering that citizens I'm talking with expect from scientists, all scientists, not only economists, that they help us to understand reality better and that they help to resolve existing problems. You defined economics as the efficient management of scarce resources. As far as I oversee transdisciplinary research, the scarcest resource relevant to the survival of mankind at the moment is stable biodiversity, meaning the non-continuation of loss of life. Good. And my second question is how a general stochastic equilibrium model helps to keep biodiversity at least stable, or better, helps to increase biodiversity. Thanks.
Thank you very much. The questions are more and more interesting, but let's hear first, listen to some answers.
Yes, thank you very much. I think your question, why are we stuck in the old age? Let me give 4 bullet point answers. The first one is our whole statistical models, and as you have seen, like that's the thing that I care mostly about, what is the SKU in the data, continues to depart from this container model. We have national statistical offices, data are being collected on a national basis, they are nationally aggregated, we have national averages, and it's extremely hard to get out of that. We're sort of like in an institutional straitjacket. Even though we know that the reality completely is different, that's hard to get away from. The second one is, and I think that's even more difficult, citizens expect more and more these days that policy choices are justified with a reference to hard evidence as to why that's the right policy choice. Citizens are less and less willing to accept somebody just saying, well, I've been sitting here for 3 decades and I think that's the right thing to do. That's no longer good enough. They want evidence, and we make evidence-based policy. What that means is that as a statistician and as a policymaker, I will be less and less willing to say, well, I think there are these other soft factors that we should really take into account, because by the time you have to pass that memo to your boss to justify why that's the right decision, and he or she will be able to defend that in front of a press corps, that's not going to be good enough. So that systematically biases us in favor of countable things, even though we know that other things matter. The third one is comparability. We want statistics that are internationally comparable. We have international statistical compendiums. These are extremely hard to change, certainly in a day and age when measuring the Netherlands needs completely different standards than measuring Nigeria. But, we pretend that we should have one and the same yardstick. Changing those takes literally decades, even though we are sort of like in a maelstrom of economic and social change. And the final one is that the users of data, including people within the academy, they always want historical continuity of their time series. So they don't want new statistical standards every 2 years because then they couldn't run any of the models that have to go back decades. They say, stick to the models that you use here, and that means that sort of like constantly updating the ways that we measure our economy in a way that reflects real-world changes is actually anathema.
I'd like to come in on that point about, there's no progress. It doesn't seem to have moved on. What's changed recently? Well, I wasn't doing macro modelling in the 90s because I was at school. But with apologies to the gentleman in the front row, I think it's a story of supply and demand, actually. And on the demand side, we had what some people have called the Great Moderation. And then there was the financial crisis. And I think that has acted as a catalyst and made people look for different approaches. And indeed, it's only in recent years that the Bank of England has started hiring outside of economics PhDs to other disciplines. And on the supply side, I think that actually computing has gotten very cheap. So there's much better software around. There are high-level programming languages which didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago. Hardware has gotten much better. And some of the skills as well of people. Economists can program much more commonly now than they could before, so they're able to put together more sophisticated or even more better but not more sophisticated models potentially. So I think there has been a change as far as I see it.
I was going to address a question of Margaret to be sure we cover all questions. So I want to thank you for your question and to say that, values, what I like in this relational self approach of Arendt, that we are not supposed to be either angel or devil. It's a way to reconcile efficiency, meaningfulness, and ethics. With the modern framing of the rational subject, you're either smart and gain and maximize your interest, or you have to be ethical. And there is always a trade-off between the two, which is insupportable, I would say. And with this relational self, it's not based on values and norms that would be sort of benchmark or absolute thing from which things would flow. With Arendt, you recognize that if you're starving, whatever you value, you need to eat, okay? So it's not a question of value then. I think that thinking that everything starts from value and then goes all the way is a way to approach that from those who have enough. And so I really think that her way to characterize the human condition allows us to reconcile the ethics and efficiency and brings rationality so that those who have more than enough, the fact of wanting more is stupid. It's not only wrong, it's just meaningless, And I think that this is very important effect of this change.
Thank you. We are very close to Søren Kierkegaard. I like that.
Sorry.
Yeah, now it's on. Okay. There was the question of scarcity that came back in 2 or 3 questions, and how to deal with that. Well, I think at the very origins, but there we are talking several centuries ago, economists started thinking about scarcity as a thing that has a price must be scarce, and a thing that doesn't have a price isn't. We have moved beyond that, and the whole branch of environmental economics, the whole branch of how to produce public goods deals with things that the market does not produce spontaneously. So the market does not spontaneously attach a price tag to biodiversity. Somebody has to intervene and attach a price tag to biodiversity for economics, then for the market system, to produce efficient results. How does that work? Well, through taxes, basically. That's an oversimplification, but basically that's it. Should we put biodiversity in a DSGE model and expect good results? I would find that very doubtful. But the point I was making en passant was that there is no single model that you can use for everything. Of course, the apples from my garden are the best, and you can't find them at a grocery. The point I was making was that one is counted in GDP because I pay a price for it. The other is not because it is home production. I think I may have used the wrong metaphor to speak with Nicole, but the point was actually that. Final point: I do believe that economists should be educated in philosophy, and going back to the founding fathers, and personalism is definitely a good idea. But I still also think that having a very, very simplified agent that you can call Homo economicus in some types of macro models still makes sense. You need to know what you use it for.
Okay, so there are many questions, but first just to say one thing about the idea of public goods or commons and market. So in the post-grow and degrow community, there is the idea that market is occupying, is really occupying too many dimensions of the life. And so it was sort of enclosure of different public and common, and particularly common goods that were not exchanged through markets. So this is an issue, and I think that part of the solution is also to come back to put some part of them, so some like flow of services and goods out of the market, because sometimes, and so for this reason also I think that job guarantee in some sense can help in understand which are the important stuff that the economy can do. It's not really a sort of public government of the economy, but of course that the public can understand which are the most important things, like, green investment and so on. So however, about the questions, the first one is not a closed model. So we have a very simple, a quite simple real exchange rate that regulates import and export. So why we apply for France is very simple, because, okay, we are looking into the future, so not really like forecasting what happens next year. We are trying to understand what's going on in the future, like scenario analysis, but we need some data about working time reduction, because we were quite interested to that policy in particular. So we have in France some data about and some consequences of the working time reduction that was made a few years ago. So I come back to the second model in a while. So one thing that is important is multidisciplinarity. I'm really completely sure that economists cannot solve this issue by themselves. This kind of model that we are building in different perspectives, they start to become possible to integrate the knowledge from one discipline with the other. So on Horizon project, there are some calls where people coming from economics or scientists can work together, because I don't know anything about the damage function. So it's very difficult for me to introduce climate change damage in the model, because I don't know exactly. But there are many people that are working on that. And so we are trying to put the things together in order to make and to understand what is going on to the system and how we can afford the difficult issue that we have. Another point that is important is that, as Nicole pointed out, we have not to rush. We have to think and sharing a view together. And for the reason we are trying to build a community, in the sense that we are looking to, so we have presented also a cost proposal just to build a network between NGOs, academics, politics, people that come from national statistical agency in order to have data. And that group of people, okay, can, using some kind of model that are building exactly to looking at that question, probably making some answer, and to find some policy, and also to advise the commissioner or other politics to do the right things. So this is our, I think, is the way in which we can go. So for the people that are interested, in few days, I think, a few weeks, in the green group, in the website, there will be the report of this work that we've done. We didn't finish completely, but almost we finished it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we spent 2 hours together. I saw many requests for the floor. I was told that so we are beyond our time framework, but the next panel is at 4 o'clock. If you wish, I have to ask panelists. We can continue with one more round. Okay. So, please. Oh. Okay.
Yeah, my name is Tom Bauer. I'm an ecological economist. I work for the Free University of Brussels, and I do have a question. I don't know to whom, but at least to the three modelers in the panel. I had two of you starting basically your presentation about saying we want our models to be useful, and then you elaborate, whether different models or better models or whatever. But that means that you seem to pursue the assumption that models are used, no? Which for me from the outside is not that evident to understand, because if I look at the homo politicus, which seem to be the people who you target your information to, that particular homo doesn't seem to be rational enough to swallow information of the kind you probably produce. And maybe you could elaborate a little bit from your own experience or from the historical accounts of what happens in your units. How are fundamental decisions like Brexit influenced by model runs, or does anybody ask you anything? And the same is for the Maastricht criteria, or for the configuration of the European ETS scheme. Have the models played any sort of role into that, or is it political decisions? Thanks.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. Noé Lecoq from Inter-Environnement Wallonie. Yes, I think the fact that many parameters are difficult to model, like Daniel Mügge said, makes very systematic, I would not say myopia, but blindness, even in policy advice. And I would take the example of the IEA. That might be an answer, a partial answer. IEA made a big chapter on energy efficiency in its 2012 Energy Outlook report, and it was mainly about fuel switch technological improvement, but nothing about behavioral changes. And there was just one page, where it says probably it has major impact. We can reach major additional reduction in energy consumption, but we cannot model it. Basically, that's what it said. And I see from the NGO perspective every day that many, in climate advice, many consultants always go towards technological innovation, advice and measures, but behavioral changes are always fully ignored. Mainly it's like that. And if you see the way that EU transport policy objectives are settled for the climate goals, it makes no sense for national policymakers to put people from their cars to their bicycles. They need to put the people from the cars to an electric car. And that way they can reach the goals, the European transport decarbonization goal. So that has very major bias, I think, the fact that behavior is difficult to modelize, and I don't see how we can get out of that blindness, and I would like you to elaborate a little bit more how it would be possible to get out of that.
Thank you. Somebody else on that side? No? Please, there are two. The lady first.
Okay. Hello? Yeah. I'm Anja Januszewski, and I do a master's in interdisciplinary mathematics and do modeling on macroeconomic systems myself. And I've got a question to the first two speakers, because I realized that there was a discrepancy about unemployment and poverty in comparison to growth or degrowth. The first speaker mentioned that growth is needed to reduce unemployment and to reduce inequality. And in the second speech, we've heard that in the policy run with degrowth, actually, unemployment and inequality can be reduced most significantly. So I would like the two speakers to comment on that discrepancy and also to comment on whether an international view on that topic, like international competition between countries for example, jobs provided by international companies, has anything to do with that discrepancy.
The gentleman behind, please.
Thank you. My name is Antonio Ferreira from the University of Porto. My question relates to the fact that in transport planning and urban planning, there has been developments which question what should be the role of models in decision making. And the understanding that is emerging and is becoming quite strong is that models should not be seen as decision support tools. Therefore, what they offer is not outputs that should be taken in consideration in decision-making processes in a linear fashion, but instead models should facilitate the learning process of the decision-maker. And so in that sense, we don't see the decision-maker so much as a rational subject under the influence or the power of the model, but on the contrary, what happens is that the decision-maker uses the model to understand reality. The question that I would like to ask is why this tendency to see the model as a tool to decision support is still dominates.
Thank you. Anybody else? One more, two more, and then three, then we will finish.
My name is Christoph Grahn from the Zoe Institute for Future Fit Economies. I was wondering, when we're talking about models and why models just focus on certain parts of the world and theories, and why we don't make any progress in the last, 30 years? We didn't even talk about pluralism in economics. I mean, we have this neoclassical theories dominating economics, and of course they're opening up to behavioral economics and so on, but still there's a lot of work to do. And there's rethinking economics, there's a network for pluralism in economics, and yes, I mean, there's feminist economics, there's ecological economics, and so on. There are many point of views on what an economy should look like. And I was wondering if this could change, that if modeling would open up a bit more to other theories, you might also have other models. As a question or a comment, I don't know.
Who else was there? Somebody? No, you, please.
Hi, my name is Andrea Czaplinski from the University of Pisa. I have a question for Professor Daniel Mügge. I'm sorry if I pronounced it wrong.
That's fine.
So I had the impression from your presentation that the general message is we should be a bit more skeptical about our usual measures and that they are not fit for the problems and the current state of our societies. I would argue on the other side that we do have better, more frequent and more accurate data. It just so happens to be mostly on private hands nowadays, even though it is created mostly by me, you and our societies on the internet. So I would like to know, in your opinion, how much of it is the fact that we don't have good measures, and how much is a choice in terms of property rights? Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Professor Klaus Pasch from Vienna University of Economics and Business. One thing that was said is its comment is that the economists are using statistical models which have no theory, and this is plainly stupid. How would you know what variables you would put in your statistical correlations or whatever statistics you're doing if you had no theory? It's clearly a ridiculous statement, but economists are extremely confused about what they're doing. On one side, you've got this approach where you're doing statistics and you're collecting data, crunching numbers, throwing anything into a box and looking for correlations, and claiming there's no theory. And then on the other side, you've got a whole bunch of theory which is totally deductive, has no relationship at all to reality, has no concern about what exists in the real economy or the real world, and is just totally internally coherent and logical and doesn't care anything about its internal logic and coherence. And finally, one comment is that Keynes was totally misrepresented. In For His Grandchildren, he did not say that the rat race was something that was not a problem. What he said in For Our Grandchildren in the 1930s was that if we go down the path of a growth economy, we will create an elite that will take over and dominate, and that this elite will be people who are obsessed by money, who are psychotic, and who will control our society. But he said that we had to do this so that we could get a growth economy to last for 100 years, so we'd be rich enough so that we could get out of it afterwards. But he didn't tell us how to get out of it. And that's the mess we're in.
Thank you. I would like to add to my very short and clear questions. One is, can we get through with just improvements of the models we know, or we need a paradigm shift or change? My second question, capital is well organized, labor is well organized, or we can say production and trade unions are strong. What we will do with consumers in our models?
Three questions quick. The first one is, how can we get these outside factors into our models? Not quite frankly, I don't think we can. In a way that I would find satisfactory and that would satisfy our own standards of scientific probity. You know, the moment you try to squeeze social cohesion as a relevant social factor into your model, I think you would have to do serious violence to a society before you can summarize that and say, well, Netherlands scores 2.3 and Germany 2.1 or something. I think you need to remove it. I'm not saying throw them into the waste bin, but they should be something that should be treated with caution, should be part of the much broader panoply of things that we take into account. You know, the kind of certainty that we expect from economic science and economic analysis is an illusion. It doesn't exist. That may be slightly uncomfortable for us, maybe also be uncomfortable for our citizens when we tell them, you know, part of what we're doing is gut feeling. We can try to outsource it to a computer, but it remains gut feeling. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. You know, we got to talk with each other. We have a democratic process to reach decisions, to entrust people with decision-making power who we think are suited for that. And there we go. Now, second question, is private data better, or what's the thing here? Google had sort of like a Google inflation index that ran for a few years and then it discontinued that. I think the key thing to understand here is that we use a lot of this kind of quantitative information as an arbiter in official affairs. So, you know, we use it, as I said, to justify policy decisions. We use, you know, different kinds of things to say, okay, you know, this country is performing so badly, for example, with its public debt that it deserves to be reprimanded by the Commission, this, that, or the other. So, you know, these statistics, they have a public function in the democratic system, and they're key tools for accountability. What that means is, I think there remains a key role for public authorities to vet these statistics, to basically say, you know, let's have Google tell us, I mean, I'm characterizing what you said, but let's have Google tell us, you know, which European member state is really violating the Stability and Growth Pact, and then let's go by that. I mean, surely different governments in the European Union would say, whoa. No, we need sort of like a public agreement as to how we measure public debt and then take that as a point of departure. So I think there's lots of information out there that may be analytically interesting. The political function of these statistics is something that will have to pass through official authorities to vet them.
I would take your paradigm shift expression to say that this is an expression that goes in with science, but in politics I would say more to change our lenses and really take out the veil that makes us think that everything should be feeding growth and growth will take care of things. Because we keep saying that growth is not everything, but we also keep saying that growth is what we are after, and it's mobilized as an argument to justify a lot of measures. So I think it would develop the imaginary of policymaker and society if we could, but I know that's a sort of a dream that cannot be imposed, but dream of the moment where growth is not a legitimate justification. So let's just avoid to use growth as a justification and justify our policies by much more substantial and direct things that matter to people. And Simone told us that what matters is reducing inequalities or lifting people out of poverty. I am quite shocked by the fact that these fifth EU 2020 target, lifting 15 million of Europeans out of poverty, is the only one unlikely to be met. So I think that really putting all the models and intelligence to this very goal and stop consider growth as an intermediary, inevitable sort of step would be a great step forward.
Hi, so I think was it Tom who asked the question about are models used by policymakers? Well, they certainly are for monetary policy, in my experience. So policymakers at the bank rely on a whole kind of zoo of models, a whole suite of models, some traditional, some increasingly less traditional, and over the top of that they apply their own kind of expert judgment. I can't talk about specific major macroeconomic events, but I would say if there were major macroeconomic events, then it's certainly something which people would be looking at in models. And then to come to your question, Chair, should we have a paradigm shift or should we just improve the models we've got? I think actually I'm going to give a really rubbish answer and say we need a bit of both. I think we do need new types of models, but I don't think we should throw away the lessons we've learned. And in fact, that kind of speaks, someone mentioned Paul Krugman's article where he said, well, actually, if we'd followed the policy prescriptions of simpler models from the 1970s, maybe we'd have known what to do in a liquidity trap. So I don't think we should throw what we've got away, but because we've got this weak model selection problem, particularly in the world that I'm in, monetary policy, then I think that we need to both extend and keep what we've got already.
Thank you. Yes, on the same topic, can we use models for policy advice? Do we use models for policy advice? Perhaps not as extensively as in central banks, but we do in some areas. There it proves useful. There are areas where you would overstretch the model if you tried to do it, and you shouldn't. No, that's quite vague, but that's in a nutshell the feeling I have here. The gentleman who told me that I was wrong about my reading of Keynes and about the theory in statistics-based models has left. Nonetheless, I do think that in Keynes' essay there is the thought that it is feasible and necessary to move away from an accumulation perspective, and the tone is overall optimistic. So yes, he sees a necessity in the medium term to produce more, to lift people out of poverty, but then he thinks a critical mass will probably be reached that recognizes that accumulation for the sake of accumulation is nonsense. Well, going back to one example I mentioned on the statistics, if you have indicators from surveys, you have a prior that somehow they relate to GDP. If you call that a theory, yes, then the model is theory-based. I would call it we are looking for statistical correlations.
Thank you. Last answers.
Just to say a few minutes before the others, I think, are pushing us out of this room. So there is this idea of an interesting, the different approach in the relation between unemployment, inequality, and growth. And so I think it's not a contradiction in the sense that it depends on the policy that you are doing. Okay, and I have a nice imagine in my mind. It's about what happens in U.S. in the last 30 years. It was the same thing that Tim Jackson was discussing this morning. If you take the average income of 90% poorest of U.S., that means probably all of us in this room are the 90 poorest of Europe, okay, but of United States. Their income, average income growth was 0.1% in the last 30 years. So it means that nobody was planning with growth. Nobody take the reward of economic growth in U.S., but the 10, the 1, the 0.1, 0.1%. Okay, so I think it's a very difficult argument to say that without that 3% per year average growth, you could not obtain the same result. So that the trickle down is so strong that it's without the 3% in average, the other people, the 90%, will get in poorest. I don't think so. I think that we can do many things in order to reduce inequality and to reduce unemployment, also without growth. Okay? But I'm not against growth or against GDP or whatever. Doesn't matter. Our objectives are different. Is inequality, is unemployment, they are much more important. So then, if we realize that GDP is increasing or not, doesn't matter at all, in my opinion. So we'll end up in growing, not growing. Doesn't matter probably, and this is the concern of most of the science that come in this room, is that without shrinking down the economy, we could not meet sustainability environmental criteria. Okay? But this can be a matter of discussion, but the important thing, I think, is that we should try to find a way to meet this important issue, to meet these threats. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I don't intend to summarize what was said in this, I would say, contentful afternoon. Thank you very much to all the panelists, but also to all participants and also our assistants who helped us to organize this panel. I only would like to say that we know enough to provide better models, but the political question is how and how fast. And the panelists are asked to stop for a while outside because we will ask additional questions there. Thank you very much.